Good evening, everybody. You are listening to yet another Radulich Broadcasting Network podcast. This time, we are taking on the Four Kings of Boxing. I'm your host, the mandated reporter, and frankly, I'm mortified, Mr. Mark Radulich. And joining me on a new book, a new deep dive, a look at the Four Kings of Boxing, Roberto Duran, Sugar Ray Leonard, Thomas the Hitman Hearns, and marvelous Marvin Hagler. As we will be taking on each one of these subjects and their subsequent fights once a month over the next several months. Ladies and gentlemen, the punchy pugilist, totally 80s, Pat Mullin. How do you do, sir?
Good evening, Mark. Good evening, listeners. Good morning, listeners. Good afternoon, listeners. Whatever time of day you happen to be listening to this, we appreciate it and we love it. And we are both excited to dive in on this. You know, this is an idea that I kind of pitched to Mark a while back when we were doing our heavyweight championship series, and he kind of was like, hey, what do you want to do next? And I said, you know, I just reread George Kimball's Four Kings book, which we're going to pull a lot of source material from this out of, and we had just, a few months after we talked about it, had the passing of marvelous Marvin Hagler, and so it seemed like the right time to kind of put something together on this. And then sure enough, months after we talked about this and we're getting ready to launch, Showtime decides to do a 4-part piece on these guys. But 4 parts isn't really enough to cover everything about 4 of the most legendary champions that have ever stepped into the ring, especially during their era, and all of whom fought each other. So we're going to be giving you guys kind of a real detailed look at this that hopefully you'll use as a companion piece to the Showtime series. And we're going to give credit along the way to a lot of material that we pulled information from, like the autobiographies of Ray Leonard, Roberto Duran, Marvin Hagler. Thomas Hearns has not had an official biographer, but of course we referred to George Kimball's Four Kings, where he had written extensively about Thomas as a young man and into his life. So there's a lot of good stuff there. You know, we're going to give credit to, you know, David Christian, who's the modern martial artist on YouTube, who does a great series of fight and style breakdowns, who I find a lot of similarities with in myself with how we look at things. So a lot of credit's going to go to him. And we're excited. This is great. We get to do this analysis of the fighters, the fights, the era, stuff that a lot of people consider the last real golden age of boxing.
And we are, chapter 1 here starts us off with Roberto Duran, one of the Four Kings. So that's where we're going to begin tonight. We're going to look at a deep dive into Roberto Duran's career from his auspicious beginnings right up until, but not including, his first match with Sugar Ray Leonard. We're going to save that for a separate podcast. Roberto Duran was born on June 16, 1951 in Guerrero, Panama. Duran was raised by a single mother, Clara, who had been abandoned by Duran's father, Margarito Duran Sanchez, an American soldier of Mexican descent stationed in Panama. Duran grew up in the slums of El Chorrillo in the district called the House of Stone in Panama City. Duran's family was poor, and as a boy, Duran shined shoes, hustled newspapers, and oftentimes had to fight with other children to protect his designated turf. Duran had no knowledge of boxing as a child except for rudimentary street fighting techniques, but said he would often mimic luchadors like El Santo that he saw in the movies. Duran wound up following his brother to a boxing gym called El Nico de la Guardia. Beginning at age 8, Duran began being mentored by Nestor Plomo Quiones, who thought the young street fighter had a hunger and a superior instinct about him that would make a great fighter. Duran had a short amateur career with records varying about how many wins he secured while universally being tagged with 3 losses before turning pro at the tender age of 16. Shortly after becoming a pro, Duran caught the eye of wealthy businessman and fight manager Carlos Aleda. Aleda had ties to American boxing promoters and essentially promoted any Panamanian fighter who fought abroad. Aleda also managed Alfonso Peppermint Frazier, who would win the WBA junior welterweight title. Aleda had sought out long-retired trainer Ray Arcel to come in and work with Frazier, but it was Duran who caught the eye of Arcel. Duran would rack up wins over future world champion Ernesto Marcel and former world champion Hiroshi Kobayashi when Arcel agreed to break his retirement full-time and work with Duran as his main fight strategist. Duran's primary training was left to Plomo, who Duran refused to leave out, and the venerable Downtown Freddie Brown, who was the inspiration for the Mickey Goldmill character, 'cause Mickey loves you, Rock, in Rocky. A crowded corner with a plethora of knowledge at their disposal crafted the street-savvy Duran into an accomplished all-around fighter. After amassing a record of 28-0, Duran was granted a shot at the WBA and lineal lightweight championship held by Scotland's Ken Buchanan. You know, Pat, I started reading The Four Kings. I'm still, pretty early into it. This is one of two Roberto Duran stories that I absolutely adored. And we're going to talk about that right now. So Roberto Duran takes on Ken Buchanan in his 29th fight on June 26, 1972, in the Mecca of sports entertainment, Madison Square Garden. Tell me about this fight, Pat.
So Duran really got this shot by, he had one fight in Madison Square Garden prior to this, and this was about 2 or 3 fights before this, against a journeyman named Benny Bang Bang Huertas. And it was on the undercard of Buchanan challenging Panama's Ishmael Laguna for the lightweight championship. And Buchanan beat Laguna for the lightweight championship by a close, tough decision. But on the undercard, Duran took out Huertas, who was known as a really durable, tough fighter, in the first round and really kind of stamped, hey, I'm here, I've arrived. Then he goes on and beats Kobayashi, and then he comes back and he gets to challenge Buchanan for the title. Buchanan at the time only has one loss on his record to Miguel Velasquez for the European lightweight championship, and it was considered controversial because he lost to a Spaniard in Spain. Other than that, Buchanan hadn't lost to anybody, and he's beaten Laguna twice, and he is a classy style fighter. Duran is largely not known outside of Panama because he's only had exposure to the U.S. against Benny Huertas, and even though he was impressive, it's a big jump to go from a guy like Benny Huertas to a guy at the top of the ladder like Buchanan.
So what happens in this fight specifically?
We'll get to your favorite part at the end.
Yes. Please do not neglect to leave out the best part of this fight. But there were some things that happened in this fight that of note, and that's what I want you to talk about.
So Duran, who has never fought for a world championship at this point, comes out like a savage. The first time I saw this fight, he reminded me of the Tasmanian Devil because he was just all over Buchanan to start this fight.
Yeah,
and
he really gives
wild.
him the business. Like he is super aggressive.
Yeah, and even somebody with the movement and footwork and proper boxing technique of Buchanan can only do so much when a guy has all of his energy and all of his stamina and hits as hard as Duran. He drops Buchanan in the opening seconds, and it's not a full knockdown where Buchanan hits the deck, but he makes Buchanan drop on his front 2 feet, on his hands to the canvas off of a right hand combination. And you can see that Buchanan isn't necessarily hurt, but he's stunned more so at the fact that how is this guy hitting me from all these angles that I don't see? And Buchanan's a fighter, and Buchanan's a tough guy, and he actually staggers Duran on the way in with a left hook that knocks him into the ropes that could have been called a knockdown if they so chose to, because Duran, I believe the referee thought it was more a balance issue, which it could have been, but a clean punch landed, and that kind of should have discouraged Duran in some sense. But Duran is so hungry and so up for this fight that he just doesn't stop charging in. And Buchanan just can't really do anything to keep him off of him until about the 8th round when Duran starts to tire because he's not used to going this long in a fight at this kind of pace against this kind of opponent. The longest Duran's gone at this point is into the 10th round against Kobayashi, who he knocked out. But he's doing it in Madison Square Garden against Ken Buchanan, who starts to put his stuff together and starts to have some good rounds against Duran where he's finding Duran more, who's starting to slow down. And Ray Arcel is in the corner pleading with him to slow down throughout this because he knows there's a chance he may have to go 15 rounds because of Buchanan's ability and his toughness. Buchanan puts together a solid string of rounds from about 8 to 11. But again, Duran just, that Tasmanian devil mentality takes over him again. And he just starts putting work on Buchanan and really going at him hard. And you can see that his punches they're not knocking Buchanan into next week. But Buchanan's known for having a real solid chin. And they're punches that you can see he's taking in the full effect of, and it's bothering him a lot. He is getting discouraged as this happens. And we get to the end of the 13th round where there's a real tough inside fight happening along the ropes. And just as it's starting to break at the bell, they're still punching at the bell. Duran gets restrained by the referee. As he's being restrained, he hits Buchanan with an uppercut directly to the testicles. That was so hard that people swore Buchanan had been kicked. And at that point, Buchanan is gripping and writhing in pain. His quarterman, Gil Clancy, is screaming that Buchanan got kicked in the groin. Duran's people have stormed the ring to prevent anything else from going on and trying to protect Duran. And you have all-out mayhem in the middle of the ring. Eventually, it's determined that Buchanan cannot continue, and the referee rules the fight in favor of Duran by a TKO. Now, it's not common that would happen, but the fight was largely so one-sided that had the referee done anything else, there probably would have been a riot in Madison Square Garden. And to put that in perspective, when people think, oh, they're exaggerating, whatever, during the Buchanan-Laguna fights, there were two bands at ringside playing. One were playing the congas and very Latin-oriented music. The other were bagpipers. And because that fight was close, after a good Laguna round, you'd hear the congas. If it was a good Buchanan round, you'd start hearing them play Scotland the Brave. You didn't really hear much of Scotland the Brave in this fight because those bands were there again, and there were a lot of congas and a lot of maracas shaken when Duran was controlling this fight.
Can you get into a little bit as to why the referee didn't make it a no contest if he was too injured to continue on a errant, low, illegal blow?
The referee at this point, and we'll give him his grace, said that he never actually saw the punch land low.
Okay.
And if you look at the angle, it's believable because of how he was holding Duran. He was holding Duran, trying to restrain him basically in the biceps and pulling him away like that. But he's also looking upward at Duran and at Buchanan because Buchanan's the one taking the most of the abuse. So he didn't see the punch land allegedly where it did. And, that ended the fight and ruled it a TKO after 13 rounds for Roberto and claimed him both the lightweight and the lineal championships of the world, whereas poor Ken Buchanan walked away with a severely bruised testicle and sadly did not get a rematch with Duran, which Buchanan has always said he never felt like it was Duran because Duran didn't duck anybody. He thought it was more a negotiation that fell through or a tactic from somebody else that cost him a shot at the championship. He'll fight for one later on against Guts Ishimatsu for the WBC version of the title, and he'll lose a very controversial decision at that point, and he'll never challenge for a world title again.
The interesting thing about this fight, other than in the manner in which he wins this title, is that this win was symbolic vengeance for Panamanian boxing fans, as Buchanan had taken the title from Panama's then biggest boxing hero, Ismael Laguna. What do you know about that fight, just as a curiosity?
The initial fight between the two, because they fought twice, Buchanan wins, and a lot of people felt that he won that fight very cleanly. It was close but clean for Buchanan. The rematch, as it took place in Madison Square Garden, a lot of people felt Laguna deserved the nod, and it went to Buchanan.
Mm. Well, Duran's team at Arcel's urging had kept him on a very tight regular schedule to prevent Duran from indulging himself too much between fights. After winning the championship, Duran began to live the high life like you do, as he would often in his career following tremendous victories, being inactive for a few months and only fighting two soft-touch opponents in non-title bouts. Duran accepted an over-the-weight non-title bout against Puerto Rico's Esteban de Jesus. De Jesus was a clever boxer whose only defeat had come via a controversial hometown decision, which takes us back to Madison Square Garden on November 17th, 1972. Now, this is a situation where they actually go up a weight class because Duran doesn't make weight. So this is fought at super lightweight. And it is notable as Roberto Duran's first loss on his career. What happened? What went wrong for Roberto Duran other than coming in high in weight?
Well, he didn't come in high in weight. This was scheduled as a super lightweight bout.
Mm-hmm.
So it was never meant to be a title fight or anything of the kind. But the fact that he's already fighting above the lightweight limit is not a good sign in terms of where they'd been and where they wanted Roberto to be. Because the goal was to keep him busy, keep him active, so that he wouldn't gorge himself, which he'll do again and again in his career. Because when you come from nothing, and Duran came from nothing, that's not exaggerating. All of a sudden, you have this fame thrust upon you, and money thrust upon you, and opportunities. His first stop after winning his fight at Madison Square Garden against Benny Huertas was to 31 Flavors, to get all 31 flavors.
Mm.
So he comes into this fight having lived the high life, having got a taste of everything that he thought. And Duran is one of those guys who a lot of times would believe that he's invincible and work himself up into a frenzy and dismiss whoever was against him. That's not a good idea when you're fighting one of the best lightweights of all time. And, you know, a lot of the reason we don't talk about De Jesus more is because Duran existed. But in this fight, he fought De Jesus, who was sharp, who was such a good boxer, such a good counterpuncher, really fast hands, and just went in there knowing he was a significant underdog, but to prove a point and earn potentially a shot at the title if he could even just perform well against Duran, let alone beat him. And he wakes up Duran real early in this fight because he lands a sweet little left hook counter on Duran's chin that puts Roberto on his ass in the first round. And everybody, including Roberto, has this kind of stunned look on their face, like that's not supposed to happen. If anyone was supposed to get knocked down in this fight, it was supposed to be Esteban, but he just put Duran down. This is going to get interesting. And Duran has moments in the fight because when you're that good, you're gonna. But De Jesus just controlled the majority of the fight and walked away with the unanimous decision and shocked the world a little bit and kind of put Roberto's life back into perspective for him, where he understands that, oh, you know what, I actually still need to work at this.
So Duran was still a champion, but the defeat would be a tremendous motivator for him. From January of 1973 through February of 1974, Duran would fight 10 times, going 10-0, with 8 KOs, making 3 title defenses, and counting amongst his victims top American lightweight Jimmy Robertson, Australian power puncher and number 1 rated Hector Thompson, and future world champion Guts Ishimatsu of Japan. This set the stage for an epic rematch with De Jesus, this time with a title on the line, held in Duran's native Panama, and this takes place on March 16, 1974, for the WBA ring and lineal lightweight titles, and poor Esteban De Jesus gets knocked out in the 11th round. So tell me about this fight, Pat.
A lot of people during the first round thought this was going to be a changing of the guard type of fight because just like in the first fight, De Jesus drops him again with a left hook counter. But that only served to really make Roberto angry and motivate him to just go out there and say, this is my fight now. And instead of the sluggish kind of off-balance Duran that we got in the first fight, we got a guy who just found his way inside of De Jesus, found ways to cut off the ring, and just punish him to the body and really work him over and start punching away at his shoulders to make him drop his guard, and just hammered and hammered and hammered away at De Jesus and really puts a brutal beating on him. And it's one of those fights where you see an all-time great get motivated against another all-time great and put on just an incredible performance that people will talk about in terms of this guy was at his best when he did this type of thing. And it's arguable that this was Duran at his very best. De Jesus tries, and he tries to do the things that worked for him in the first fight, But Duran is just having none of it. He's able to cut off the ring effectively and predict where DeJesus is going with his footwork. He's able to not just throw one punch at a time, and he's able to time DeJesus' counters and slip them and counter with body shots of his own, which are vicious. And he really just turns into a real complete fighter here. He had been billed as Rocky Duran when he made his MSG debut. And even when he fought Buchanan, they were calling him Rocky Duran. And part of that's because they thought he was like a lightweight Marciano because he was this destroyer. It's around this time that his nickname changes to Manos de Piedra, the hands of stone, because he just lays waste to these 10 opponents from 73 to 74 up until this fight. 8 KOs over those 10 fights in a year span, 3 of which are title defenses against top-rated guys whom he knocks out, all of them. And he really just endears this reputation as this guy might be the best fighter in boxing, especially when he's able to beat DeJesus, and not just beat him, but knock him out.
That was the thing that stood out to me as I watched these first couple of fights that we were talking about, is how much he's such a high volume puncher, but he's not only throwing a high volume. I mean, every time he lets his hands go, it's always a combination, and he loves that right hook, and it's a right hook that it's not just meant to punctuate a combination. He is looking to knock your head off every time he throws it.
Yeah, and again, it's kind of, there's almost a subtle transformation here that goes on where the Duran we see against Ken Buchanan is clean-shaven and short-haired and looking, like a nice kid from the Central American area. And now he starts growing out his hair. He starts growing out this beard. He practices what we've come to know over the years as the Duran sneer. And he starts looking more and more like a bad guy. And he starts fighting more and more like a bad guy.
Where did that come from?
More than anything, from everything I've read in his autobiography by Christian Giudice, Hands of Stone, from interviews I've seen with Duran, all I can hear in my head playing is No More Mr. Nice Guy by Alice Cooper. And it was just that mental shift in Duran where after that loss to DeJesus, he was determined to just not let that happen again. And he started just cultivating this kind of persona to make himself intimidating beyond just his incredible fighting techniques, which again, we see the improvements over time during this period where, we talked about how he's able to cut the ring off against DeJesus and his combination punching. There's such beautiful subtleties to it where he starts using what's called the Fitzsimmons step, which is a subtle step where you feint a punch with your rear hand, but what you really do is you shift into the opposite stance, which for Duran would be a southpaw stance, and now you've brought your power hand closer inside to where your opponent wanted to move, and you've cut them off from moving that way, and you force them to move the opposite way into a counter punch. You see Duran when he's slipping punches, he's not just slipping, he's coming back, particularly with that right hook to the body, and just really letting his hands go. And he's just always in position to punch and not get hit in return. It's brilliant inside fighting. And people tend to mischaracterize Duran as an aggressive brawler. In reality, he's what we call an aggressive matador, because he's drawing the actions out of you by coming at you, making you do what he wants you to do, and then picking you off for his counters.
Yeah, he didn't strike me in any of the fights I saw as necessarily wild. High volume, active, violent, yeah, but I never saw him as out of control or just sort of winging punches. Everything had a purpose. There's a lot of counterpunching. There's a lot of finding angles. I mean, it's funny. This is only the first one of these that we've done, but I can already see the difference in his fighting style versus a lot of the heavyweights heavyweight fights that we reviewed over the past year. With that said, let's take a pause for the cause and pay some bills. let's talk about Grammarly. Grammarly's AI-powered products help people communicate more effectively. Grammarly helps you write mistake-free on Gmail, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and nearly anywhere else you write on the web. Grammarly corrects hundreds of grammar, punctuation, and spelling mistakes while also catching contextual errors, improving your vocabulary, and suggesting style improvements. To download Grammarly today, go to getgrammarly.com/W2Mnetwork. Again, that's getgrammarly.com/W2Mnetwork to download Grammarly for free. All right, so Duran would go on to reel off another 6 victories, squeezing in a title defense against Matsama Takayama that ends in 1 round before meeting number 1 contender Ray Lampkin of Portland, Oregon. Lampkin had narrowly lost an earlier fight to DeJesus, but rebounded to win the NABF lightweight title and earn a shot at Duran's belt. This occurs in Panama on March 2nd, 1975, and poor Ray Lampkin is knocked out, fucking silly, in the 14th round. And here's the thing about this one. Duran, while, as we've talked about already, high volume and violent, he fought this fight smartly. He was methodical. He used a lot of combinations and pressure. Talk about it, Pat. What did Duran do in this fight to break down Lampkin and finally get the KO in the 14th round?
I know I just said this about the second Esteban DeJesus fight, but this might be the best example of Duran at his very peak. Ray Lampkin was a great fighter. He was. People say, oh, he's overrating him. No, Ray Lampkin was a top lightweight at a time when top lightweights were as good as it got. And he did not win a round against Roberto in this fight, who for whatever reason was just jacked up and so sharp, so smooth. Lampkin wasn't a big puncher. Lampkin was more in the vein of a DeJesus, where he's going to land a lot of combinations and make you move, but he couldn't find Duran. Duran would bait him by just being in range and then just shifting his head slightly out of the way. And one of the things Duran could do maybe better than anybody in history is he had the ability to roll with punches. And sometimes that wound up costing him on the scorecards because that long black hair moving when he rolled with a punch, people assumed the punch landed. But 9 times out of 10, it's not landing with real impact because he's rolling with it, because he's timed it and takes the impact off of it. And what that does is discourage a guy too, because the guy sees that I'm touching him, but I'm not hitting him. And Roberto did that to Lampkin repeatedly and never let Lampkin finish a combination. When Lampkin would throw, Duran always had 2 punches to 3 punches waiting in return. And he started the fight in the heat, just breaking Lampkin down to the body. Every time Lampkin threw a jab, Roberto would feint his own jab, make Lampkin throw his out again just to expose his left side, and just pound a right hand into his body. Then he would start coming back with the left hook and then another right hand upstairs. And eventually, Lampkin gets so conscious of this beating he's taking to the body that he starts exposing his head willingly. And in that 14th round, Roberto lands maybe the best hook he'll ever land in his career, right on Lampkin's chin, and just knocks him completely unconscious. He gets stretchered out and taken to the hospital. It's that bad of a knockout. And maybe more than anything, the post-fight gives Duran that persona that we just talked about.
Yeah, I want to touch on that in just a second, but to give you an idea of how powerful a puncher Roberto Duran was, legend has it, he punched a horse and knocked it out. Some say it was directly in the mush, some say it was kind of in the body and the horse kind of keeled over. Either way, you know, you see it in Blazing Saddles and it's funny. When a guy does it in real life, it's frightening.
Also, keep in mind, when they do it in Blazing Saddles, it's Alex Karras, who is 6'4", close to 300 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
Duran's 5'7" and 135 pounds.
And knocking out horses. So you can imagine what this poor bastard Ray Lampkin was going through in that fight. Yeah. Not only does Duran sort of adopt this sort of wild man, Tasmanian devil persona with the long hair and all of that. Go ahead.
I was going to say, and I'll go to Grammarly because I wanted to get this quote right.
Mm-hmm.
But literally, he says, I was not in my best condition. Today I sent him to the hospital. Next time I put him in the morgue.
Put it on a t-shirt, Mindy. That is that is brutal. Over the next 2 years, Duran would fight 13 times. He would twice beat Pat Mullin's future trainer, Edwin Virouette, with Virouette being the only man to last the full 15 rounds in a Duran lightweight title defense. Hey, give me 50 words on Mr. Edwin Virouette.
Great mover. Really frustrating guy to fight. Did do his best to make Duran look bad in both of their fights by doing a lot of moving and not engaging. They talked a lot of smack to each other, really didn't like each other. There's a lot of cursing that goes on if you listen. Their title fight was at the Philadelphia Spectrum, and Edwin wins a share of rounds, but it's more from passivity and just frustrating Roberto into not looking good. Edwin was a great guy. He taught me a lot about balance and footwork. He's one of the old school Gleason's gym guys who a lot of people grew to love because he was around there so much. Nothing but good memories with training with Edwin.
Very good. He notched non-title victories over future world champion Sal Mamby and the previously mentioned Virouette. He would successfully defend his title against the likes of the great Villamar Fernandez and Leonicio Ortiz during this stretch, until finally getting the opportunity to unify the championship in 1978 against the WBC champion and arch nemesis Esteban de Jesus. And this takes place January 21st, 1978, in Caesars Palace, Las Vegas, Nevada, Paradise, Nevada. And he will win via TKO in the 12th round, retaining the WBA ring and lineal lightweight titles and unifying it with the WBC lightweight title. All right, Pat. This was described as a brutal beating of De Jesus. What all went wrong on this night for Mr. Esteban De Jesus?
Roberto Duran.
Mm-hmm.
De Jesus finally got a world championship. It wasn't the lineal world championship, so there's always the, well, you're not really the man type of argument from people. And that's fine, whatever. But he got his shot against Guts Ichimasu, who we talked about before, who had fought both Duran and Buchanan, and he won it. And he not only won it, but he made 3 title defenses over 1976 and 77 after he won it. And he's another guy kind of living the high life at that point after coming from not having much. And unfortunately, De Jesus is a victim of something that's going to cast a big cloud over a lot of the 70s and the 80s, and that's drugs. And he's particularly going to struggle with heroin and cocaine. And a lot of the thought process is before this third fight with Duran that De Jesus is starting to really mess around with drugs heavy, and it's taking a toll on his career. And in this fight, I'm not saying he didn't show up in shape. I'm not saying he didn't take it seriously, but the difference between how he performs in this fight and the first two is extremely noticeable because he's not competitive at all in this fight. Duran just takes him from the opening bell and doesn't even really have to work all that hard to do it. Duran's battering him with right hands almost from the start. He drops him multiple times, and De Jesus just never looks in it. He's hurt throughout. He's fighting at times just to hang on and try to last, and Duran's just not having that and really just batters him with these long-range right hands repeatedly until finally in the 12th round the fight's called. And it put Duran on the cover of Sports Illustrated at that point. It gained Roberto recognition as the undisputed lightweight champion, and for many, it made him officially the best pound-for-pound fighter in boxing. And it was the end of probably his most personal rivalry to this point. Arguably the most personal rivalry of his career. We'll talk about the other one that kind of gets there later. But this was really him putting the exclamation point on not only his feud with De Jesus, but his run as a lightweight, where he just accumulated an incredible record, beating one of the deepest lightweight divisions of all time and doing so in dominant fashion.
However, Duran's personal struggles with the high life had been taking their toll on his body. His struggle to make the lightweight limit of 135 pounds had been well documented prior to this rubber match with DeJesus, and after the fight, Duran would officially vacate the undisputed lightweight championship in February of 1979 to move up in weight and attempt to challenge for the welterweight title. You kind of touched on the DeJesus stuff, so some of this might be a bit of a repeat here, but there's a lot of great notes here, so I kind of want to go through this, if you don't mind. For DeJesus, the end came quickly and it was bitter. DeJesus admitted during his career he struggled with the aforementioned drugs, both cocaine and heroin. DeJesus retired just 2 years after the fight following an unsuccessful challenge for Manby's junior welterweight title. DeJesus infamously murdered a 17-year-old he had a traffic dispute with after having injected himself with cocaine. DeJesus would begin a prison sentence that led him to a baseball career, becoming a 3-time All-Star in the Puerto Rican penal system. However, in 1985, DeJesus learned that his brother had died due to AIDS. DeJesus had shared needles with his brother while using drugs and tested positive with symptoms quickly appearing following the diagnosis. While in the hospital, he was visited by Duran, once his most bitter rival, and Duran's daughter, Irachelle. Duran embraced his once-hated rival, hugging and kissing him in the hospital bed, showing no fear at a time when the world knew very little about AIDS and its predecessor, the HIV virus. DeJesus would pass away in 1989 due to the AIDS-related illness. So back to Duran. Duran made his welterweight debut against Adolfo Viruet, the brother of Edwin. After winning a unanimous decision, Duran would point at the brothers and yell what was loosely translated to, "Next time your father." Yeah. Duran would KO Raiders junior welterweight Monroe Brooks in 8 rounds and take a unanimous decision from Jimmy Ayer before meeting former welterweight champion Carlos Palomino at Duran's second home of Madison Square Garden. Palomino was only 5 months removed from his reign as welterweight champion, ending controversial split decision to Wilfred Benitez. The fight with Palomino would be what many would tell whether Duran could compete with the top welterweights or if he was just a blown-up lightweight. And this occurs at Madison Square Garden, as I said, on June 22nd, 1979. Roberto Duran would win a unanimous decision in 10 rounds. So what happens in this fight?
Oh, boy. What happens in this fight is a virtuoso performance. It's maybe the best big fight performance you'll ever see out of somebody. You have Duran, who's moving up to a heavier weight class, and he's essentially jumping right over junior welterweight to go to welterweight because that's where the money fight is for him. It's actually a couple money fights for him at this point. We'll discuss a little bit later, and he doesn't exactly take on anybody soft. He's taking on Carlos Palomino, who is just the not only WBC champion, but the lineal champion, the real welterweight champion of the world. And Carlos Palomino's no slouch. He's beaten guys like Mondo Muniz, Billy Backus, John H. Stracey. Carlos Palomino is the real deal. And basically you get Duran going in there to just completely own and annihilate Palomino through 10 rounds. He's so brilliant in this fight where he is able to bull Palomino into the ropes and he'll clinch and wrestle with him and use superior hand fighting to create openings for Palomino. He'll start punishing him one way and then control Palomino's arm and twist him one way against the referee's vision and open up a punching lane for him where Palomino can't hit him and counter. And then immediately when Duran's done punching, he's dipping under whatever Palomino tries to fire back at him. He in the 6th round, I believe it is able to make Palomino bite feints on the distance and hit him with a right hand right over his jab that drops him into a corner and puts him down. And Palomino gets up and he comes back to fight, but good Lord, it's such a complete performance of the most brilliant infighting you'll ever see, where he just shows you every little thing. He shows you how he changes stances on the inside to cut off exit lanes and to create punching rooms. Shows you how he can use his head on an opponent's opposite side of their chest to judge where their movement's going so he knows where to punch. Can shift his weight to make them bite on a feint and create an opportunity to punch. It's partly instinctual. It's partly based on the fundamentals he's learned from Plomo and the direction from Freddie Brown. And it's part of that strategy package that Ray Arcel is programming into him that puts this fight performance together. And in this fight, anybody who was doubting Duran's ability to succeed as a welterweight had a lot of questions answered. Was he going to be able to bully another welterweight around the way he did as a lightweight? Did he hit hard enough to really hurt or drop an elite welterweight, a top welterweight? Could he do the job knowing he was struggling with the weight when he put extra weight on? Could he do it over 10 rounds or 12 rounds or 15 rounds? And the Duran in this fight, it's maybe and the crazy thing about it is this is a Duran who's past his prime. This is a Duran who's fighting 2 weights above his best weight, and he's still able to do all these things against a great fighter in Carlos Palomino.
Well, our story takes a brief pause after the next 3 fights here. He rattles off 3 wins in September 28th, 1979, January 13th, 1980, and February 24th of 1980 against Zeferino Gonzalez, where he wins unanimous decision, Joseph Subuga, who he retires on the stool in 4 rounds out of 10, and Wellington Wheatley, which is a fabulous name.
Wheatley.
That is amazing, that name.
I'll tell you what I like about the Wellington Wheatley fight.
Yes, sir.
It actually has nothing to do with the fight itself. Before the fight aired, which I believe at the time it was on NBC that it aired. Before the fight happens, you know the song "Angry Eyes"?
Sure.
They literally play a montage of Duran's highlights to that song over a silhouette of his face with his patented sneer and dead eyes.
Nice.
It was such a cool visual, and it wasn't something that was being done a lot at that time. So it was a very cool promo package for Duran especially. And then, of course, he fights Wheatley, who's the Caribbean champion at the time, and just batters him until the 6th round and knocks him out.
All right, so we will end our story here, but not before I tell you that his next fight, his 73rd fight, he will compete for the WBC ring and lineal welterweight titles against Hall of Famer Sugar Ray Leonard. To be continued. That is where we are going to end our story on Roberto Duran tonight. But before we go, Pat, what are you listening to these days? Not Night Ranger. You told me they suck. And, I only know the one song by them. But I thought you'd be more excited about that. So besides Night Ranger, what else are you listening to?
What else have I been listening to? Well, the Jonas Brothers are going back out on tour this fall, which is awesome. I'm planning on seeing them in 2 states. I'm going to see them in Connecticut, and I'm going to see them in Jersey. Nice guys, great fellas. One of them is married to Sansa Stark, which is just bonus points for me. So right on, Joe Bros. I'm with you. What else? What else am I listening to these days? I'm not listening to Dr. Feelgood because Mark decided to do that episode of the Metal Hammer of Doom without me for reasons I don't understand.
You don't make yourself available to me when I need you, so I just assume this is all you want to do. That's what happened there.
You assumed, and you didn't think I would free up my time for one of the best produced albums of all time, which is just a shame.
It is amazing, isn't it? It's almost damn near perfect.
It's very close, and it's also why the band ended up breaking up not that long after. But art is pain, and truth is beauty, and beauty is truth, and all those sayings. What else am I listening to these days? Is there an album I liked recently? Probably not. I've been listening to a lot of In My Feelings stuff. I've been listening to some what's out there, some Debbie Gibson, some Mandy Moore, and that was and in correlation, I just finished the most recent season of This Is Us. All the kinds of stuff you want to hear on a boxing podcast.
Absolutely. And if you want to hear any of those bands that Pat just mentioned, check out our link in the description of this podcast, getamazonmusic.com/W2M Network. If you fill out the form at that link, you will get a free 30 days to use the Amazon Music service. You can stream all the music you want for free. And if you like it after 30 days, there's a monthly fee. And if you don't, you can cancel it. But in that 30 days, all kinds of things you can listen to. All the bands that we talk about in the Metal Hammer of Doom, the bands that Pat just mentioned.
And just saying, fellas, if you're out there and you have an Alexa or an Echo Dot or whatever you'd like to call it, if you have Amazon Music, It's real easy to put a real good playlist together when you're going to have company over, okay? Trust me, guys.
There you go. Light a candle and have some sexy time. Why not do it accompanied by a soundtrack from AmazonMusic.com? Alrighty. Next chapter that we will be doing, I believe is... no, here it is. It'll be in June, and it'll be Chapter 2, and we will be talking about Marvelous Marvin Hagler. Also in the month of June, we will continue our deep dive into the history of WrestleMania, this time focusing on the big one from the Pontiac Silverdome, WrestleMania 3. In the meantime, you can check out all of our podcasts that we've done this past week. Today, we re-aired a deep dive into the Ultimate Warrior's title reign and why it didn't work and what could have been done to fix it. And we tackled a lot of the misnomers and assumptions and outright lies about the Ultimate Warrior's title reign and set the record straight. It's a great accompanying piece to the two documentaries that have just aired. One was this evening's Dark Side of the Ring, which was mostly his first wife's kind of side of the story, and the A&E biography, which if you thought the Savage one was a bit of a hit piece, this one was almost like the Hall of Fame documentary they did on the Ultimate Warrior, where suddenly all the bad things about him went away, and it was nothing but good stuff.
So are you telling me I shouldn't watch the Dark Side of the Ring one, Mark?
Here's what I told Jerome, who used to do podcasts with the late Larry Zonka. Watch the A&E one, the Dark Side of the Ring, the Hall of Fame documentary, and the Self-Destruction of the Ultimate Warrior, and listen to our podcast. And by the end of it, you'll actually have a complete story with some truths. But you know what you won't get, other than when you listen to us? None of these deal with the fact that Vince McMahon lied to the Ultimate Warrior on paper. They just gloss over that every single time. It's always like, we got to get the match in the ring.
We didn't gloss over that.
No, we didn't. Shine the light right on it. Anyway, so that's all the wrestling and boxing stuff. Almost all the wrestling and boxing stuff. The Floyd Mayweather-Logan Paul fight is coming up on June 6th. I
don't want to talk about that.
There's a handful of people threatening to cover that fight with me. We may or may not be covering the Devin Haney-Jorge Linares fight on DAZN on Saturday, so look for that if we end up doing it. In the meantime, we reviewed this past week, we re-aired, rather, Luke Cage Season 1. We reviewed Invincible Volume 2, 8 is Enough, Man of Steel by Bendis, Galactic Kraken, Starship Velociraptor, Castlevania Season 4, and Invincible Season 1. Tomorrow is a re-airing of Maleficent from way back in the early days of Damn You Hollywood, before we called it that.
Was I on that?
I don't know if you were or not. I know you were on Days of Future Past, and you obviously were on The Amazing Spider-Man, because that's what started this. But I don't remember if you were on Maleficent or not.
Oh, that might have been. Maybe I was, maybe I wasn't. Guys,
Yep.
Bong Diaries, what are you going to do?
So you'll listen to it, and you'll find out when it re-airs tomorrow.
I don't think so.
In any case, Jeff Sloboda is making his return to the Radulich Broadcasting Network. He's going to review the new Michael B. Jordan, Tom Clancy movie, Without Remorse. And Robert Winfrey and I got into an argument about the Amazon purchase of MGM Studios, whether or not it was overvalued at almost $9 billion. We're going to talk about it on that show. So 5 minutes of saying Michael B. Jordan's movie sucks, and an hour and a half of me and Robert screaming at each other with poor Jeff Sloboda in a corner, crying and wondering why are mommy and daddy fighting. So check out that podcast when it airs, because I'm sure it's going to be hilarious. Saturday, Jesse's got a What If Spider-Man Kept His Cosmic Power syndicated source material, and another re-airing, another series that's starting to re-air, because Cruella, this is why we're re-airing Maleficent, Cruella is coming to theaters on May 28th, which is tomorrow as we're recording this. Everybody Loves a Bad Guy is back. Robert Winfrey did that series for a whole bunch of years back in the Blog Talk Radio days. He has cracked open the archives. He's recorded some new intros. He's edited down the nonsense, and we are re-releasing those one at a time, starting with Disney Villains Part 1, where ironically we did not talk about Cruella de Vil.
Awesome, except for the Disney Villains episode, because I'm not on that.
Next week, Alexis and I are reviewing Disney Great Parodies Volume 1, Mickey's Inferno, which is a parody of Dante's Inferno, which I think is hilarious. We're reviewing Cruella. Jason, Alexis, and Robert will be reviewing A Quiet Place Part 2, while I will be reviewing Bongzilla, Wisconsin, with Jesse Starcher. Chris Bailey and I will be reviewing AEW Double or Nothing, and then finally an on-trial for the Glenn Close 1996 101 Dalmatians. Pat, what are you doing these days?
Mostly just this.
Fantastic. All right, so stay tuned for more from myself and Pat Mullin in the month of June. Until then, this has been the Four Kings of Boxing, Chapter 1 on Roberto Duran. He's Pat Mullin. I'm Mark Radulich. Be well, be safe, and behave.